Welcome to episode 703 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hilton, and it is beyond fortuitous. We've been in talks for a while, but it is beyond fortuitous that today's special show comes immediately after the signing of Marcus Rashford on loan to Barcelona, because today we're talking all about the last Englishman to play for FC Barcelona in Gary Lineker. I don't do too many history videos on the channel, but I feel like I do more than most Barcelona channels. So today is one that is close to my heart, that we get to talk all about Gary Lineker. And the man to help me do that is none other than Chris Evans, the author of the book, Gary Lineker, A Portrait of a Football Icon. Thank you so much for joining the show, Chris.
Thanks for having me on.
So firstly, before we do Lineker, because this whole show is about Gary Lineker, but firstly, I do have to ask you about the current events with Marcus Rashford. Just the second English player for Barcelona in 100 years. And I'll just ask you, as somebody who's impartial to all of this, how do you like Rashford's chances of succeeding, particularly in a World Cup year where he could fight his way onto that plane here to the US?
I think he should do well. He's clearly a good player, and I think it just was a cultural as well as I say cultural misfit with Ruben Amorim at the Man United. But I think also there is a feeling that he needed to get away to kind of clear his head and start away. And I think he did all right at Aston Villa on loan last year. But this move actually takes him outside of England as well, and actually I think that's kind of what he needs. So a lot of people will follow that and see the clips on social media of what he's doing over at Barcelona. I think that's probably for the best, because he's going to score, he's going to assist, he's going to be in great company. So I think his numbers will start looking better, and I think once he's got confidence and he's away from that media glare over in England, I think that's got to be a positive for him. So I would be surprised if he didn't make a success of it.
Well, I think it's going to be really interesting, because I think he's expected in the UK to be a main character. And for Barcelona, people are upset because they wanted a main character, another one. But with Lamine Yamal and Rafinha and Lewandowski, I don't see how Marcus Rashford is ever going to be that guy. And I think the one critique that a lot of Kool-Aids have had in the last 48 hours is that his salary of close to 14 million plus appearance bonuses it's almost impossible for him to equal the contributions that a 14 million euro player has to give you on the wage bill and in a squad, because he will not be a starter. But again, which would be an interesting position for him, because now he's going to have even less minutes than he had last season at a club they didn't really want to be a part of. Ferran Torres was the backup forward, and he had just over 1,900 minutes. And last season, Rashford was able to, I'll use the quotes here, fail with close to 2,200 minutes. So I think that's where the skeptics are coming from. But as I said, I think it's, to your point, really great that Marcus Rashford is actually getting to challenge himself in a new location, where I think the Catalan media and the British media, there are definitely some things that in a negative way overlap in the way that they treat certain players. And I think Marcus Rashford is among them, but hopefully he, again, has the time to kind of settle in, figure some things out, and work through it. So one of the guys he could call to try to help him get accustomed to Catalonia, of course, is Gary Lineker. And I bet Gary Lineker actually posted on his Instagram that giving him a good luck. So, those two are in contact. So let's talk all about now, again, your book, A Portrait of a Football Icon. Lineker was a Leicester City kid in a time when football money wasn't entirely life-changing just yet. He committed pretty hard early on in his life to that dream, even if it was in the second division, didn't he?
Yes, he did. I mean, look, Leicester were always his club, and he saw them, went to Wembley and watched them lose to Man City in the FA Cup final. It was his dad's club, it was his granddad's club. So this was where he was going to make his mark. And I think as soon as he saw that opportunity, he wanted to take it. His family had always run a market stall, fruit and veg market stall in Leicester City Centre. Now, I think it was a little bit more lucrative back then than perhaps it is now, just because of the way that the world was, and everyone used to shop down there in Leicester. But I think even so, he didn't want the early mornings, and so it wasn't perhaps a financial thing, but he wanted to make sure that he was playing football rather than kind of bringing out bananas and apples at 5 o'clock every morning and going to the fruit wholesaler. So I think that was a key driver for him, that he wanted to move on and be his own man and make his own career.
Yeah, I also think it's quite interesting when you said his grandfather Leicester was his club, because again, in his mid-60s now for Lineker, when you talk about his grandfather, now you're flirting with the origins of the club. Like, very quickly, we're going back 3-4 generations, and you're talking about the beginnings. So Leicester, do get promoted in 1983. He's the first division's joint top scorer in 84-85. And remember, this is before the EPL. That's why I'm saying first division. And then Everton comes to swoop him up in a time where in the 80s, when we talk about the big clubs in the UK, Everton is among them at that point. So this is a big club swooping in for Lineker. He spent just one season, though, on Merseyside, but it was a pretty great 10 months, which is pretty interesting to his story that it was just 10 months there, and yet Everton fans do remember him pretty fondly.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a mix, really, because I think, you say Everton were a major player, so yeah, they'd won the league title the year before he joined, and actually won the league title the year after he joined as well. So his year there, they came second. They lost the FA Cup final against Liverpool in '85. But Lineker personally scored, I think it was 41 goals that he'd got that season across all competitions, and it was a brilliant return. I mean, anyone who's scoring that number of goals, it's fantastic. And it'd actually been the first time that he'd left Leicester. He'd lived with his mum and dad throughout all the time that he'd been at Leicester City. So actually going to Everton and living on Merseyside, that was a big move for him as well. So to have achieved that with all that kind of personal stuff behind him as well, was quite impressive. But yeah, I mean, I think it depends who you talk to from an Everton side. I think some people are like, yeah, look, he scored 40 odd goals. He was the main man for England. It's quite happy that he was there. But I think the fact that they failed to win the league and then they lost in the FA Cup final, I think that has been tricky for some people to kind of grasp because it wasn't the most successful season for Everton, even though on a personal level it was for him.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention with the player, we didn't really have a chance to profile who he was. So he was a striker. I think to do our due diligence, he was a striker. And I saw throughout your book, the word poacher is thrown around, but in a very positive way. And the way that I think it's difficult to compare eras. If you were to profile Gary Lineker, and I obviously did not prepare you to give me apt comparisons about modern players and who he might be like. But if you were to say about what his qualities were, what made him, in at times in his career, an elite goal scorer, what were they?
Well, it was his intelligence, I would say, more than anything else. I mean, he always talked about it's not being in the right place at the right time. It's about being in the right place every time. So, the supply might not happen. A ball might bounce off, ricochet. But you see so many of his goals, particularly if you look back at his England goals, and there were so many where there'd be a deflection or something would drop, and there'd be Lineker stretching with every sinew to get on the end of it, and he had that knack. And I think that was what he was about. He was very fast. He could turn a player, but he probably didn't. Um, he didn't have as much of an impact in the build-up as you would perhaps expect strikers to do today. I think the similarities, and actually in the epilogue of the book, there's a little bit of a comparison between Erling Haaland and Lineker now. Into the fact that sometimes you see touch maps with Haaland where he doesn't touch the ball, but he then will get a hat trick. And his touch, he'll have had about 12 touches in the entire game or something obscene like that. And Lineker was a little bit like that as well. He was considered, until actually went to Barcelona, that he couldn't play with his back to goal particularly well. Um, so, yeah, he was very much the sort of quintessential poacher in that way. And perhaps you don't get so many of those strikers nowadays. But yeah, at that time, there were quite a lot of those players who did something like that.
Well, now speaking of England, we're going to come to the 1986 World Cup in Mexico. What did Lineker do there to attract Barcelona's attention? And I do know you also mentioned in the book that Barcelona were already looking at him prior to the World Cup, but what do you do with the World Cup to kind of announce to Barcelona at least that's the guy that you got to sign?
So yeah, there had been a little bit of they'd been looking around because Howard Kendall, who was Everton manager at the time, had been widely expected to go and take over at Barcelona that following season. But then that deal didn't happen. There was a bit of a feeling that Kendall might have been trying to feather his own nest and pushing Lineker that way as well. But the Kendall move didn't happen. They remained with Terry Venables. And I think there was a bit of a chat about, let's get Lineker's team over to talk to us. Now that meeting for his agent to go over to Barcelona was arranged during the World Cup. So Lineker himself wasn't aware of that. But in between that being arranged and the agent actually going over was the game against Poland, which was England's third one of the World Cup. And he scored a hat trick in the first half. England had actually been struggling and they'd only got 1 point for the first two games. And yeah, Lineker's hat trick turned things round, not just for England but for himself, because it announced him to the world stage. So the move to Barcelona may still have happened, and he still had those 40 odd goals for Everton behind him. But actually scoring a World Cup hat trick right before that meeting, and then following it up with two more against Paraguay in the second round, that really, really helped him. And kind of secured his position, perhaps not so much as just a great striker from England, but actually as a world star.
Yeah, so we mentioned he does represent the British Isles at Barcelona pretty well in that there were other contemporaries in the British Isles with him. As you mentioned, manager Terry Venables, also from England, Scottish striker Steve Archibald, and Wales striker Mark Hughes, all in that same Barcelona team. So a little bit of comfortability, I guess, to say, with, again, a manager that speaks the same language and then teammates that also speak the same language. What kind of expectations, though, were there for Lineker coming to Catalonia then after the success of Everton in the World Cup?
I think it's difficult to know. I mean, by today's standards, you would imagine, guy scored 40 goals in the top flight of the English football, and then scores a hat trick in the World Cup, and is kind of like gets the Golden Boot in '86. You would imagine there was loads of pressure, but actually, it was probably a little bit different, because for a lot of Catalonians, they probably didn't know a lot about Gary Lineker,
Yeah.
because there wasn't the coverage that there was then. So they knew the top line stuff. Um, and actually, at first, there was a few questions about Lineker and Hughes and how that partnership works. And actually, Lineker got the goals, and actually his values of being a poacher helped him, because there was a feeling that they might have been a little bit underwhelming at first, but he got his numbers, and his numbers made sure that people kind of, he was known as Gary Goal after a while, and everyone loved him. But I think there was a foil to it, that Mark Hughes, who was the big man to his little man in Lineker, Hughes didn't have the best of times at Barcelona. And I think he was almost a cover for during those hard times where there might have been a run of a few goals. People were still focusing on Hughes. And actually, Steve Archibald, who wasn't getting in the team earlier on in the campaign, he actually got back in, and Hughes was dropped out and then later went on loan to Bayern Munich. So I think they both helped Lineker in a funny sort of way to cover that expectation. But as soon as the goals started coming, that it was very difficult. And obviously, he scores a hat trick against Real Madrid as well. So that that's always quite a good thing to do.
Well, that's what I want to speak about because, yes, Lineker shows up on the heels of Barcelona losing the 1986 European Cup to South Bucharest on penalties. And unfortunately, because Everton and all English clubs had been suspended from or banned from playing European football at the time, so Lineker is finally able to play, in theory, European football. But remember, this is also a time when only one entry per country joins the European Cup. So again, it's Real Madrid in Lineker's stead during that time. So Barcelona and Lineker settle for the UEFA Cup, where they are then upset in the quarterfinals by eventual runners-up Dundee United from Scotland. But worse is that Lineker never scores then in the UEFA Cup in that competition. That said, the same season, as you said, he does have a hat-trick and 3-2 win of Real Madrid. I guess I ask in that season because, again, we're going to get to his two other managers as well in a second here. But under Venables, it does feel like a little bit of a mixed bag for Lineker because, yeah, he winds up having a hat-trick 3-2 win over Real Madrid. And while the European success isn't there, I guess I'm going to lean towards the idea, just saying those words out loud, hearing myself say hat trick against Real Madrid. I feel like I know where most Catalans, what they would choose of those two. If they would say, okay, we want him to score in the European Cup, or we'd want him to score the hat trick against Real Madrid, despite Barcelona not winning the league that year.
Yeah, I mean, he had a lot of moments. I mean, he scores on his debut, scores a hat trick against Real Madrid. Actually, for England, he then went scored four for England against Spain in Spain. Um, so he has those moments that people probably stick in their mind as being, wow, this is what Lineker can do. But I suppose it's difficult. I think that he found the defences were trickier to break down. They were probably Spanish football was probably a little bit more tactically adept than English football at that time. So it was trickier for him to do. So to achieve those numbers was perhaps difficult. And perhaps some of that nuance as well, because of what I said about the lack of coverage, as much as there was, probably was lost a little bit. But yeah, look, I think he clearly was the man that they wanted to keep around going forward. Like I say, Mark Hughes was moved on. Archibald came back in, but he wasn't really seen as the future, but Lineker was, in many senses, that he'd shown them what he could do in those moments. And I think that's that was enough, I suppose, that he'd got those moments that endeared himself to those fans. And I think there was a promise of more to come in the future.
Well, unfortunately, some bad news comes in '87. Venables was gone, replaced by Luis Aragonés. Lineker was fine, though. It seemed like the team struggled, got sixth in the Liga that year, but Lineker was fine, but still underwhelming in total goals. How much of that do you put on Lineker at his own feet, and how much do you put on what was happening with the rest of the team under Luis Aragonés and the change after Venables?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was one of the worst seasons Barcelona had ever had. So, I
Yeah,
mean, that is part of it. But there were a lot of, I mean, I can't remember the stats off my head, but it's in the book that there was an eye-watering number of nil-nil draws where they failed to score.
yeah.
And I mean, look, some of that, it depends which way you put that, doesn't it? I suppose that on one side you say, well, it's down to Lineker to score the goals, but someone needs to be creating these chances, and perhaps it was that Barcelona had these, an embarrassment of riches in that side, that it was easy to shut them out a little bit. So yeah, it was a difficult time, but I think it's a difficult time for everybody, not just Lineker. Although I'm sure he would have liked to have scored a few more goals, but he did go through a little bit of a lull towards that end of his spell at Barcelona. And obviously, we'll get on to Johan Cruyff, but yeah, it wasn't. He did have, after so many years of scoring so many goals for Leicester, Everton, England, the first year at Barcelona, there was perhaps that little plateauing. Um, at Barcelona, there were lots of big stars, there were lots of big names, and I
Mhm.
think that was probably also part of it.
Right. In that era, a reminder that Jose Roman Alexanco, who is currently still at the club, and then a guy who is most known for his Real Madrid time because he also managed them in Bernd Schuster. Those are the ones that attracted so much more attention than Gary Lineker in that time, as you mentioned. And then the next season, it's time for the Esperia mutiny, where Lineker says goodbye to his manager and a ton of his teammates. And I'm not going to have you explain the Esperia mutiny. I've mentioned that before in the past, but it's something that has to have its own little video on my channel. I've got to do my homework on that to let people know what happened with the President Nunez, and again, a mutiny of the players and some of the coaching staff. But how did Lineker, who was one of the few, again, that we'll say survived that upheaval, so how did Lineker handle those politics as one of the few foreign players? And also remember, this is prior to the Bosnian ruling, so those were only 4 international spots. And at that time, when I say international spots, I mean outside of Spain. So not actual, like, there's only 4 non-Spanish players in that squad. So as one of those, again, like marquee foreign players with that kind of pressure, how did he handle all those politics at that time?
Well, there's two sides to that answer, I suppose, because one side of it, the way that he always worked is that he kind of tried to keep his nose clean. He was known as kind of a football's Mr. Nice Guy in a sense, and that was because he wasn't, certainly not publicly, very outspoken. So I think there was a lot of that going on. There were actually people who were more likely to push themselves to the front of the queue. Obviously, you mentioned Bernd Schuster. There were issues with him that were going on as well. So I think that he didn't need to kind of take a leading role in that sense. But he also, I mean, obviously the changes came, and Johan Cruyff was brought in to try and sort everything out, not just on the football side, but bring a bit of order kind of elsewhere as well. But Lineker at that point actually was absent because he went to Euro '88 and
Mhm.
he actually contracted hepatitis. So he played Euro '88, even though the fact he said in the last group game, England lost all 3 of them, but his last group game he'd asked not to play, but he got stuck in the team anyway, and he was struggling a lot to keep it to keep even on the pitch. That he said he just couldn't stand up. And when he came back to England after that Euros, he actually was in hospital for a little while and had to recuperate. So he missed quite a lot of pre-season. He wasn't there. He came back a couple of weeks into the season and obviously had to his own sort of preparation for that as well. So I think whether his role would have been different had he been there, I don't know. But yeah, there was he kind of had his own things on his plate at that time, and that's perhaps why he survived Cruyff's cull as well,
Yeah.
because there was a feeling that Cruyff was obviously changing things around. He wanted Marco van Basten. He liked, himself come off an incredible Euro '88, and there were a lot of things that he wanted to do. But again, Lineker not being there perhaps hadn't been given the opportunity to be seen to do that, and I think that maybe had an impact. But Lineker wanted to stay. in Barcelona. He liked it in Barcelona. He'd learnt the language. He was happy with what he was doing. Visitors came over to him all the time. And I think he liked the lifestyle as well. So I think he didn't want to throw the towel in. And also, I guess, he had the numbers to back him up to say that
Yeah.
he could work quite well.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because that has been a common theme up until this very hour about players moving to Barcelona saying it's pretty gosh darn nice here. If they're paying me to be here, I want to be here. And that has been, I think, throughout the history of the club, that has been the answer for a lot of players. So we've been talking about Johan Cruyff, and you kind of already mentioned and answered the next question, which is not to say what went wrong there, but that following year when Lineker goes to join Tottenham, before he left, he did win the 1989 European Cup Winners' Cup, so finally a second trophy at Barcelona for him to join that Copa del Rey the year before. But still, even as you said, grand total numbers, 42 goals and 103 league appearances, the highest British score in the Liga until Gareth Bale came along. So we've I've kind of been asking you this question in a myriad of different ways, but I think very definitively because now we're moving in the timeline Lineker to Tottenham. So do you think, and I've also been on record of saying that I think that Lineker, I think I had him at, of my top 50 Barcelona legacy players, I think I had him at 49 or 50. So I did have him there. Like he had enough seasons and he had enough goals where I think he partially defines a little mini era where they didn't do a lot of winning, but that is a case for a lot of players in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for FC Barcelona. That is very much the case until, again, Johan Cruyff kind of changes all of that. So I'm not sure if I want to say, I'd say, what was your final verdict as to whether or not on that scale, and it's not just pass fail, but it's on that scale of was Gary Lineker's time at Barcelona a success? Where do you land on that spectrum?
I would say that you've got to go off what the fans' reaction to him was, and they loved him as Gary Goal. They didn't want him to leave. There was an incident against Real Madrid towards the end of his time there where he was left on the bench, and Barcelona needed a goal, and Lineker was there, and Cruyff didn't use him, and Lineker was always quite calm, but this was one night that he actually lost his temper, and he shouted at the fans were calling for Gary to be put on. But Cruyff didn't, and Lineker shouted. He goes, "Oh, you don't have the balls to bring me on." And this was something, and it was such a big thing at the time that it was seen as kind of like really disrespectful to Lineker. And obviously, Cruyff wasn't a man that was backwards and coming forwards with his own opinion, but
Yeah,
he kind
right.
of kept quite quiet. Um, and I think he even went back to Cruyff went back to his family home, and Jaap de Groot, who was a big friend and ghostwriter for Cruyff, Dutch journalist, was there at the time, and Cruyff's wife actually said, "Well, why didn't you bring Lineker on? That's really, it was really disrespectful of you." And Cruyff didn't say anything. He just went away, and I think there was a lot of that going on at the time. But I think the fans' reaction to that was that they wanted to see Lineker. They didn't want him to leave. And I think that they would have been the ones who, particularly at a time when there's not as much coverage as there was, like based on what their reaction was, that would come down as a success. If they were kind of, you know, they didn't really care, they were quite apathetic about it, I think that would feel a bit different. And I'm sure there are, some fans that would tell you vote both ways, but the overarching feeling from the fans within that stadium at that time was that they wanted Gary Lineker. They didn't want him to leave. So I think that's where I would go, that it was a success. Yeah, of course, it's not to the same level as we're talking about a Messi or players now that kind of go over, but it was a different time. And I would say that overall, I would say it's a success, if not kind of like a huge success, like a megastar today, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I think his legacy is almost hurt by the fact that he leaves, and the man who just like for like kind of replaces him is Julio Salinas, who is a Spanish player who winds up again not having to fit as one of the foreign internationals, and that allows Barcelona to then bring in the foursome of Laudrup, Koeman, Romario, and Stoichkov, all
Yeah.
four of which are I would say I'd say not in name cachet necessarily, but in terms of their legacy at Barcelona, they wound up rising above what Lineker was even prior to that because of all the winning that was done and the change that happened there. So we did talk about the 1986 World Cup, but he did almost score 50 goals from England. And I remember when I was little, I had this little figurine, this little plastic figurine. I have no idea where we even got it from, but it was this little figurine of Lineker in an English jersey, or an England jersey. So, I did prep you for this beforehand, but the player, when I'm looking at his international career with England or and his club career, the player that he reminds me of career wise, not again like for like as a player, but he reminds me of the way we talk about James Rodriguez, because James Rodriguez played for and has played for some gosh darn big clubs, and we remember him from the 2014 World Cup. And when we think of the James Rodriguez in a Colombia shirt, you're going, oh, that guy was an all time defining the 2010s and all those things. And I think for Lineker, it's very similar. You think of England in the 1980s, and he is one of the first names, if not the first name, that pops into your head from that time period. And so I don't know. That's my comparison. I hope you like it. But do you think to that point that it's true that Lineker is widely more appreciated as an international player than anything he did for any of his clubs? Because I'm trying to imagine him in a club uniform, and I'm not even sure which shirt I put him in.
No, I don't. I don't think so. Not quite. I mean, not certainly not in the same way James Rodriguez scored. I mean, there were. I mean, that one goal that he scored in the World Cup was incredible. I think Lineker scored about outside the box about twice ever. Um, but yeah, like, I think that he did have his moments. So even from in an England shirt, um, he never worked out for him playing in the Euros. But the '86 and the '90 World Cups were incredible, and he won the Golden Boot in '86, and he came close to doing it again in 1990, and nearly had England in the final, and played such a key role. And I think that it depends, because I think that overall, I think people remember those England moments, but that's because I think you always remember a World Cup more than anything else. But he did go to Tottenham and he won an FA Cup there.
Yeah.
You know that he was fans in Barcelona loved him. I think Everton is where it's a little bit anonymous. Maybe Leicester, he was a legend, but again, he probably when Jamie Vardy retired this year, everyone was talking about Vardy being the greatest ever. And I suppose that's where maybe this is where your point is right, that Lineker was there for a number of years, won Golden Boots, but everyone still considered that Vardy was the man at Leicester. But that's not to say, I mean, he's still a Leicester legend. Tottenham fans love him. So I think it would be wrong to say that he didn't enjoy some club success, but I think those big moments, those big memorable moments, always did come in an England shirt.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of sum that up. That I think there are good moments at each of those clubs, and to that point, you're right. Leicester and Tottenham and Barcelona, all the fans who remember him from those time periods remember him very fondly, and I think that's a really good point. And again, Lineker, that's why he's one of the all time greats, because again, there wasn't there might have been matches that were difficult for him, but there weren't periods of time. He always found a way back to scoring goals, which is again where you get your praise. So then Gary Lineker, speaking of praise, becomes a broadcaster for many, many years. He starts working for BBC from 1995 all the way to 2024, being a mainstay on Match of the Day, which for those who are outside the UK is the premier BBC flagship sporting show. So he does that for, I'm allowed to use the word decades here. What made him such a great broadcaster and so prepared for that transition?
Well, I mean, I've spoken to a few people about this, and they kind of said that the nature that he was quite calm probably helped him um, outside of the football pitch as well. So that's why he scored so many goals. That he was calm in front of goal, and if he made a mistake, he would put that behind him, go again. I think actually being a broadcaster is part of it, so especially being on live TV as Match of the Day is, or presenting match coverage. Something can happen out of the blue, and you don't want somebody who's going to panic. So I think that probably helped him. But he wasn't a natural. He'd seen the opportunity and people liked him, but he probably needed to work on it a little bit more. He kind of he retained that Leicester accent, but he did have voice coaching to try and make it so that he was going to work a little bit better to kind of fit with the BBC style. So he did have to work hard at it to make it work. But I think it was just of the time what they were looking for. And I think he was a little bit fortunate at times too. That Des Lynam was a pantheon, one of the greatest ever
Mm-hmm.
sports presenters over in the UK, and he moved to a rival TV channel, and he'd kind of taken Lineker under his wing, um, and given him a few tips. But then he moved to a rival TV channel, and that opened up the way. No one expected it. That opened up the way for Lineker to be there, and he took the opportunity brilliantly. And he had that sort of like quick wit that he's quite known for, and that worked quite nicely for him. But he's all. I would say there's similarities between being a player and being a presenter, in that and a pundit, in the sense that when the opportunities arose, he took them. Again, his first TV appearance actually was for the World Cup final in 1986, where they had him in on the studio at BBC because they thought he was going to win the Golden Boot, which he did. But again, it was that there was an opportunity there, and he did quite well, and people liked him. So yeah, it was, when you get the opportunities, you got to take them, right?
Yeah, and that's what he did. So here's what I'll say about Gary Lineker to put a bow on our little conversation here. I may not be 100% with him politically, but I do, as people have been listening to me for 8 years potentially, I do often agree with him, particularly about his critiques of the British government. And most importantly, I respect the hell out of the way that he conducts his business and kind of stands on his business, as to say, politically. And with all that said, and some of the controversy that went towards the last 2 years of him and his exodus from the BBC, do you think that, I know this is probably an easy no, but do you think he's going to be best remembered as a football player or as a pundit and a media figure at this point?
I think it comes down to your age, probably.
Yeah.
I think that if you were around during the time as a player and those England moments, 100% as a player, but he was a pundit for longer, as a presenter longer than he was a player. So therefore, to some people that was it. He was the man off match of the day. And part of the reasons we did the book was because we thought that a lot of people didn't know that story of him as a player. So that was going back through there. But I do think, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what his legacy is in a few years' time. At the moment, obviously, everyone's very aware of the controversies around him, and rightly or wrongly, some of the things that he'd said. I think there's some things, if he stands up for some things, you kind of like, that's great. And I think in a social media age where people, they're looking for authenticity, that comes with opinion. Mm-hmm. And I think that just jarred a little bit with the BBC. However, there are obviously one or two things that happened afterwards, that I don't think he did deliberately, but did obviously naturally upset people. And you can understand that's why. And that's why it kind of ended the way that it did for him. But I think when that, in a few years' time, when those controversies are kind of more of a distant memory, I think that's when we'll find where it kind of lands. And are people going to be talking about him as former England striker Gary Lineker, or are they going to talk about former BBC presenter Gary Lineker?
Yeah.
And I think that's what it is. What's his adjective? What's describing him?
Well, the most important question I have to ask you is the last one. So other than the show notes and description for people watching or listening to the show, where can people find your book?
Well, I mean, if you're in the UK, you can get from all good bookstores, particularly Waterstones is in there. But then globally, I would say Amazon is the best place to get it from. I mean, I think it's available in North America as well, and across Europe. So yeah, I would say, if depending where you're based, that's probably your best bet.
All right. Well, Chris Evans, thank you so much again coming on to discuss your book, Gary Lineker, Portrait of a Football Icon. But more importantly than that, just, again, talking about a player that is, to me, again, a top 50, top 75 player in the club's history. But because of a lack of trophies at that time, we don't really talk about him with the same praise. But now, I think most importantly, he is back in the news, because if Marcus Rashford has, I will say this, even close to a career at Barcelona that Gary Lineker did, I think anybody would take that, including Marcus Rashford, 9.7 out of 10 times. I think that would be the case. Yeah. So that legacy of English players at Barcelona is not very long. It was going, again, back 110, 115 years, but not for now. So I appreciate you coming on and talking about what could be a new chapter in that legacy. Chris, thanks so much for the time.
Great. And thank you for having me.
All right. Again, you can find his book down in the show notes or description below, and you will hear from me in a few days' time. Likely Barcelona's done with their signings for the season, but you never know. And also, we've got preseason beginning in, I believe, less than a week's time. So I will be back on Big Up for those watch-alongs. And again, you can join me on not only the watch-along, but I appreciate all the love I've been getting on YouTube recently and social media and the podcast apps as well. So without further ado, over to Barca.